The gasps echoed through St. Catherine's Sanctuary the moment Pastor Marcus Williams raised his hand toward the Virgin Mary statue. Father Rodriguez stepped forward, but Marcus was already in motion, his palms striking the marble face with enough force to chip stone. Instead, an invisible wall slammed him backward across the altar steps. The 50 witnesses from both congregations watched him skid to a stop against the front pew, his black suit jacket torn, his carefully styled gray hair disheveled. The statue remained perfect, unmarked, as if nothing had touched it. Marcus pushed himself up on trembling arms, his face pale despite the Florida heat pouring through the stained glass windows. He had come to this interfaith dialogue meeting with one purpose: to prove that Catholic veneration of Mary was nothing more than misguided tradition. His own evangelical congregation had sent him as their representative, trusting his 20 years of ministry experience and his doctorate in systematic theology. Now, those same people stared at him from the wooden pews, their expressions shifting from support to confusion to something approaching fear. The Catholics on the other side of the aisle had gone completely silent, some making the sign of the cross, others simply staring at the undamaged statue with tears in their eyes. Father Rodriguez reached Marcus first, offering his hand to help him stand. Marcus jerked away, brushing dust from his jacket with shaking fingers. The silence stretched until Mrs. Chun from the Catholic side whispered that she had seen the statue glow just before the impact. Her words sparked immediate debate across the sanctuary. The evangelicals shifted uncomfortably, their certainty cracking. Deacon Johnson from Marcus's church stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmur. This had to be some kind of trick, he declared, maybe magnetic fields or hidden wires. But his explanation sounded hollow even to his own congregation. Marcus felt their eyes boring into him, waiting for their pastor to provide answers, to make sense of what they had all witnessed. Instead, he found himself staring at the Virgin Mary statue, searching for any sign of damage, any crack or chip that would prove his hand had connected with something real. The marble surface remained flawless, the painted blue robes as vibrant as ever, the gentle expression unchanged. Behind him, he could hear his own people whispering among themselves, doubt creeping into voices that had been confident just minutes before. Some were already reaching for their phones, ready to share the story with the wider community. By Sunday morning, the story had spread through Clearwater like wildfire. Marcus stood behind his pulpit, facing a congregation split down the middle. Half the pews sat empty, filled only by those who had witnessed the event firsthand and couldn't reconcile what they had seen with their pastor's teachings. The other half overflowed with curious visitors from neighboring churches, drawn by rumors of supernatural intervention. Marcus gripped the wooden podium, his prepared sermon about religious deception forgotten. Elder Patricia Williams, no relation despite the shared name, had called 3 times demanding his resignation. The board meeting scheduled for Tuesday would determine his future, she had warned. His own daughter Sarah sat in the front row, her 16-year-old face troubled as she watched him struggle for words. She had been asking uncomfortable questions all week about Mary's role in Christian faith, questions that Marcus found himself unable to answer with his usual theological certainty. Behind her, the Hendersons had brought their sick infant, hoping the pastor who had experienced a miracle might pray with special power for their child's healing. The weight of their expectation pressed down on him as he realized his congregation no longer saw him as their confident spiritual leader, but as a man who had encountered something beyond his understanding and been forever changed by it. Sarah Williams woke from the dream gasping, her pajamas soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning. The woman in blue had spoken to her again, the same gentle voice that had been visiting her sleep for 3 nights running. This time the message was clearer. She was to pray for the Henderson baby, to lay hands on the child, and ask for healing through the intercession of Mary, Mother of God. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. She had been raised to pray directly to Jesus, never through saints or Mary. But the dreams felt more real than anything she had ever experienced, filled with love so profound it left her breathless upon waking. Downstairs, she could hear her father pacing in his study, his footsteps wearing a path across the hardwood floor as he struggled to prepare a sermon that would explain away what couldn't be explained. Sarah knew he blamed himself for the church's turmoil, saw how the weight of doubt had bowed his shoulders and stolen his sleep. She wanted to tell him about the dreams, about the peace she felt when the beautiful woman spoke to her, but she knew it would only add to his burden. Instead, she slipped on her robe and walked to the kitchen, where she found her father sitting at the table with his head in his hands, surrounded by theological commentaries that offered no comfort. The argument erupted when Sarah told her father about healing Jessica Martinez's migraines at school simply by touching her forehead. Marcus slammed his coffee cup down hard enough to crack the ceramic handle. These supernatural experiences had to stop, he demanded. They were dangerous delusions that could destroy what remained of his ministry and their family's reputation in the community. Sarah stood her ground in their kitchen, her young voice steady with conviction that unsettled him. She couldn't control what was happening to her, she explained, but she wouldn't deny the miracles flowing through her hands or the gentle woman who appeared in her dreams, offering guidance. Marcus forbade her from discussing these visions with anyone, especially not with members of their congregation who were already questioning his leadership. When Sarah asked why God would give her these gifts if they were wrong, Marcus had no answer that satisfied either of them. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm, father and daughter staring at each other across a theological divide that seemed impossible to bridge. That evening, Sarah locked herself in her room and prayed the rosary she had secretly purchased, each bead carrying her petition for her father's heart to soften and for wisdom to navigate the growing rift between his teachings and her spiritual experiences. Sarah collapsed during Wednesday night youth group while the teenagers were discussing forgiveness. One moment she was sitting cross-legged on the carpet. The next she was on the floor, speaking in a language none of them recognized. Youth Pastor Tim Chun called Marcus immediately, his voice shaking as he described how Sarah's face had taken on an otherworldly peace while foreign words poured from her lips. By the time Marcus arrived, Sarah was sitting up, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to explain what had happened. She had seen a vision of Jesus embracing his mother, both of them weeping for the divisions in their church family. The words she had spoken were about mercy triumphing over judgment, about God's love working through unexpected vessels. Dr. Patterson at Clearwater General found no medical explanation for the episode after running every test he could think of. Sarah's vital signs were perfect, her brain scans normal, her blood work pristine. The medical mystery only deepened Marcus's confusion and fear. That night, as he tucked his daughter into bed like he had when she was small, Sarah looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 16 years. She asked him why he was so afraid of miracles when Jesus himself had promised greater works would follow in his name. The screech of brakes and shattering glass brought Marcus and Sarah running from their front yard, where they had been arguing about her missed curfew. A Honda Civic had slammed into the oak tree across the street, steam rising from its crumpled hood. Marcus dialed 911 while Sarah sprinted toward the wreckage, ignoring his shouts to stay back. The driver was unconscious, blood streaming from a head wound that looked fatal. Sarah crawled through the passenger window before Marcus could stop her, placing her hands on the injured woman's forehead. Marcus watched in stunned silence as his daughter began to pray in that same unknown language from youth group, her voice barely audible above the hissing radiator. The bleeding stopped first, then color returned to the woman's pale face. By the time the paramedics arrived, the victim was sitting up and talking, asking what had happened. The EMTs found no trace of head trauma, no explanation for the blood that had soaked the steering wheel just minutes before. Marcus stood on the sidewalk staring at his daughter, finally forced to confront what he could no longer deny. Sarah looked back at him with eyes full of compassion rather than triumph, understanding that she had just shattered the last of his theological certainties. Marcus slipped into St. Catherine's through the side door at midnight, using the key Father Rodriguez had given him weeks ago for emergency pastoral visits. The sanctuary lay shrouded in darkness, except for the votive candles flickering before the Virgin Mary statue, the same statue that had somehow repelled his strike and remained unmarked. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls, and knelt before the marble figure that had become the center of his spiritual crisis. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself without words to pray. The theological arguments that had sustained his ministry for 20 years crumbled in the face of what he had witnessed through his daughter. As he stared up at Mary's serene face, the gentle expression seemed to come alive in the candlelight, offering not judgment, but maternal compassion for his confusion and fear. Tears he had been holding back for weeks finally came, deep sobs that shook his entire body as 20 years of certainty dissolved into humble acknowledgement of mystery beyond his understanding. When he finally looked up, the statue appeared unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted within him. He understood now why his daughter spoke of the woman in blue with such reverence, why miracles flowed through hands lifted in intercession to the Mother of God. Marcus spent the following week immersed in Catholic theology books Father Rodriguez had quietly loaned him, studying the doctrine of intercession with the intensity he had once reserved for preparing sermons against it. The more he read about Mary's role as the Mother of God, the more he understood why millions found comfort in asking for her prayers. She had said yes to God's plan when an angel appeared to her, had stood faithfully at the foot of the cross, had been present in the upper room when the Holy Spirit descended at Pentecost. How had he missed the scriptural foundation for honoring the woman who had brought the Savior into the world? Sarah found him at the kitchen table Thursday morning, surrounded by books about Marian apparitions and the Rosary, his coffee long cold as he traced the theological connections he had spent decades rejecting. When she sat down across from him, he looked up with eyes that held new understanding rather than fear. He told her about his midnight visit to St. Catherine's, about the peace he had felt kneeling before the statue that had somehow protected itself from his violence. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her touch carrying the same healing warmth that had restored the accident victim. And Marcus finally understood that God had been answering his daughter's prayers all along. Marcus stood before the packed sanctuary at St. Catherine's on Sunday evening, his hands trembling as he faced the combined congregations. His voice cracked when he began his public apology, admitting that his pride and theological arrogance had blinded him to the beauty of Catholic devotion to Mary as the Mother of Jesus. He spoke of his daughter's miraculous gifts, of the healing he had witnessed, of the peace he had found kneeling before the statue he had tried to destroy. When he finished, the silence stretched until Mrs. Chun began to weep, followed by others throughout the sanctuary. Father Rodriguez embraced him publicly, announcing their new joint ministry to serve struggling families regardless of denomination. The Hendersons came forward with their now healthy infant, crediting Sarah's prayers through Mary's intercession for their child's complete recovery from the respiratory illness that had nearly claimed his life. Marcus's own congregation sat stunned as their pastor proposed converting the unused fellowship hall into a food pantry operated jointly with St. Catherine's. Elder Patricia Williams walked out in protest, but the majority stayed to discuss how they could support families facing eviction, medical bills, and unemployment. By the end of the evening, volunteers from both churches had signed up to staff the new ministry that would become known throughout Clearwater as Mary's Kitchen. Mary's Kitchen opened 6 weeks later in the renovated Fellowship Hall, where Catholic and Evangelical volunteers worked side by side, serving meals to anyone in need. Sarah moved between the tables like a gentle presence, praying quietly with families facing impossible circumstances, her hands bringing comfort that transcended denominational boundaries. The Ramirez family received not just food, but healing when Sarah laid hands on their diabetic father, whose blood sugar levels stabilized without explanation that amazed his doctors at Clearwater Medical Center. Mrs. Patterson found her depression lifting after Sarah prayed the rosary with her, teaching the elderly Protestant woman the same prayers that had sustained Catholics for centuries. Marcus watched these daily miracles unfold as he served alongside Father Rodriguez. Their theological discussions now centered on how God's love manifested through Mary's maternal intercession rather than divisive arguments about proper worship. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the unusual partnership, describing how a failed attempt to strike a religious statue had somehow birthed the most successful interfaith ministry in the county's history. Donations poured in from across denominational lines as people witnessed the healing power of unity between Christians who had found common ground in serving the least fortunate members of their community. 1 year later, Marcus stood in his own church sanctuary unveiling a beautiful statue of Mary holding the infant Jesus, donated by grateful families whose lives had been transformed through Mary's kitchen. His Sunday sermon focused on Mary's fiat, her yes to God's plan, and how her example of humble obedience could guide all believers regardless of denomination. Sarah, now 17, had become a bridge between communities throughout Central Florida, her reputation for miraculous healing drawing people from both Catholic and Protestant backgrounds who sought her prayers. The young woman who had once hidden her rosary now led interfaith prayer groups where evangelicals and Catholics discovered their shared love for Jesus through honoring his mother. Marcus's ministry had evolved beyond anything he could have imagined, centered not on theological arguments, but on the practical love that flowed from recognizing Mary's role in salvation history. The Virgin Mary statue at St. Catherine's remained unmarked, a permanent reminder of the divine protection that had sparked this transformation. As families continued to find healing through Sarah's intercession, and the two congregations worked together, serving their community, Marcus understood that the miracle had never been about protecting a statue, but about protecting hearts from the pride that divides believers. Have you ever witnessed grace transform someone who seemed beyond hope, maybe even yourself? Share your story of how division became unity in the comments below.